Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing a junior designer's portfolio. She mentioned that it's been difficult to get job interviews lately, so my goal is to help her solve that problem. Even though her portfolio is fundamentally pretty good, I think that she's making some subtle mistakes that are preventing her from getting job interviews. I'm going to point out what I believe those mistakes are and also point out what's working well. If you're a junior designer, watch this until the end because a lot of this feedback will likely apply to your portfolio as well. And even if it doesn't, this will teach you how to analyze portfolios at a higher level and pay closer attention to the details that truly matter. Now let's get into it. So here's the portfolio that we're going to be reviewing. I'm primarily going to focus on the homepage and the first case study because those are the main things that a recruiter or hiring manager is going to be looking at. So now I'll scroll down this page to get a quick overview. We have this hero section where she introduces herself, and then this work section with 1, 2, 3, 4 case studies, some testimonials, and then a contact section. Now I'll get into some of my feedback. So when I'm reviewing a junior designer's portfolio, I'm definitely not looking for perfection. But what I am looking for is solid overall storytelling, an above average quality of work, and a strong consideration of some of the smaller details throughout the portfolio. If a designer can do that well, they're going to have a much easier time getting job interviews and eventually offers. Now, with that being said, for this portfolio, I'm getting a pretty strong first impression. I think visually this looks pretty clean, and there are a few little details here that I think are working well, like the circles in the background and the use of color here in the subheader. She's also doing a good job communicating who she is and what she does. But I think there's also some mistakes that are here in this hero section. The first one is that there's 3 different fonts being used here. There is Quicksand used in the header, Monsterrat in the subheader, and then Railway being used here in this navigation. So it can be fine to pair different fonts together, but I would say that this combination isn't really working here, and you never would really want to use more than 2 different fonts at a time. So I think the best thing to do here would be to pick one popular web font and just use that all throughout the portfolio. Some good ones would be Monsterrat, Poppins, or Open Sans. Making that change would be a quick, easy win. Now, another thing worth pointing out is that in the navigation, there's not a lot of contrast between this purple text and the background, and also the text within this resume button over here. I checked both of these on a contrast checker for web accessibility standards, and they both failed. So fixing that would be another quick, easy win. With both of these pieces of typography-related feedback, they might not seem significant, but any experienced designer would open this portfolio and notice those things right away, and that alone could make them move on to the next portfolio immediately. So that's why I'm spending time pointing those things out here. Now, scrolling down this page, there is the work section, and there's this toggle between UX UI case studies and logos. My recommendation would be to take out this toggle here and only include UX UI case studies. Logo design work isn't going to help much for getting a product design job, and someone could think that your attention is split between logo design work and UX work, so I think taking this out could only be beneficial here. Now, I also had some feedback about these case study cards. So the way this works is you hover over the image and then the title appears down below. So I would highly recommend moving the title above the card here. So it just goes title and then description, and then also increasing the size of that title. So the way this is set up now is very uncommon interaction, and it's a pretty significant UX problem in my opinion, because if somebody's scrolling down the page and they have the bottom of the card cut off, they're not seeing that title. And if they scroll down and they're not hovering over it, they're also not seeing that title, which is a very important piece of information. Another thing that I think can be improved is these descriptions. So right now it looks like it's just saying what the app does. So like here it says transforming English verb conjugation learning. But I think a better way of writing descriptions is to say what you did and the outcome of the project in that description to make people want to read more of that case study. I'll show an example of how I did this in my own portfolio. So I said, for this Insight AI case study, overhaul of a SaaS app that led to multiple enterprise customers. So I think there's always a way of structuring a description like this, even if you don't have tangible business results to talk about there. So I think that's definitely worth something to consider. Another thing that I wanted to talk about here is the presentation of the design work. So overall, I think this thumbnail is pretty good. I like the way that the mock-ups are laid out here. But I am noticing some issues with the actual design work. They mainly have to do with the sizing and spacing of elements on the screen. For example, this next button is too large relative to the text above it. The spacing between this text and the cards below it is too tight. The icons are a little bit too big. So it's a lot of little things like that on the screen. So my recommendation would be to find some similar looking screens, either in a real product or on Dribbble. Compare the two screens side by side. Look at what they're doing in terms of sizing and spacing, and try to copy some of those patterns on your own screen. I think that's going to help this work look a lot better. And it should be pretty easy to bring these screens to the next level because there is a solid foundation here. Now, with all that out of the way, let's take a look at this case study. Now, I'm going to scroll through this case study so we can get a quick overview. So we have a research section, some persona maps, empathy maps, some interviews that were done, ideation, some concepting work here, the colors, wireframes, testing, iterations, and then results and lessons learned. So my first impression scrolling through this case study is that it's too long. I put this into a word counter, and it's about 3,100 words in total. For context, my longest case study is about 2,300 words, and that's for a feature that I worked on over 2 years. So I would recommend trying to make this about half the length. UX portfolios have been trending towards much shorter case studies in recent years. Since people are primarily scanning through portfolios, the emphasis should be on telling the story through headlines and the work itself. That isn't to say that the content isn't important, so I'm still going to give some detailed feedback on that. Now, to get into specifics, I'll start with the header here, where it says, "Get regular, transforming English verb conjugation learning." So I think the main thing that's missing here is a strong hook. It's kind of some similar feedback that I was giving about that description sentence on the card that we saw before. So I think this should ideally be kind of like an expansion of what I was talking about in a description where you're talking about what you did and the results. So I think doing something that's about 2 sentences long here where you explain more about what you did would be ideal. I will give an example, again, of what I did in my own portfolio, where we click into the case study, and what I wrote was, I led the design of a SaaS web app for an artificial intelligence startup in the sales space. As a result, they obtained many new high-ticket customers, unlocking an additional $20,000 to $30,000 in monthly revenue. So I know it would be hard to get into specifics like that for what I think was a concept project here. But you could say something like, I led the design of an education app focused on bridging key challenges in English learning, creating an intuitive, engaging experience that boosts students' confidence and skills. That's just something that I came up with, but you can also make that your own. Now, as we go down the page, there is the section about role, team, and tools. I think it's a good idea to include something like that, but I think it's a mistake to put the labels at the bottom here like this. So I would just move that order around. And then now we get to this overview section. And in here, there's information about what this app does and the goals of the app. I think there is a good opportunity here to talk more about the context of this project and some specifics about your role. And then we also have this design challenge question. So how can I design an interactive digital product for secondary school students who struggle with applying English irregular verbs in the correct context in a fun and motivating way? I think that all sounds really good. So I'll move on to the next section where you talk about the problem. So in here, the main point is that the students at this school are struggling to learn irregular verbs, and it's resulting in consistently low test scores. If you're watching, I would recommend pausing this and reading exactly how she wrote this because it's a really good example of a problem statement. My only feedback here would be to make the headline of the section more scannable. So one way to potentially say this would be that students struggle with using irregular verbs in sentences, resulting in consistently low test scores. I think that would be a really good thing to understand without needing to read this whole paragraph. And then also like this image over here that actually shows the low test scores. One thing is you might want to just consider making this image a little bit bigger because it is slightly difficult to read. And then below here is the section called cause, where it's talking about the objectives of what they're trying to accomplish here, how they're trying to incorporate visual presentations and interactive exercises to help students understand these verbs better, which I think is great. My only issue here is with the label cause. I think goals might be a better way to label this and kind of make it a little bit easier to understand like what's going on in this section. And then there is this research section where she talks about how they work to understand the perspective of stakeholders, but the main focus was understanding the perspective of the students, which is good. And then there's this interview section where they were talking about how they weren't able to get that many students to participate. So the teachers offered this free out of jail card, which gave them a pass on their homework as an incentive for them to participate in these interviews, which I think is fine. I did have one piece of feedback here where she's saying, I kept this free out of jail card in mind because it was an interesting finding that I wanted to incorporate into my product somehow. I could see other designers being kind of nitpicky about this because there isn't any real evidence that this strategy that worked in the classroom would also work in a digital experience. So you might want to say something like how this was an interesting observation and thought there might be an opportunity to incorporate this into the app and not make it seem like you're making premature product decisions based on this. Just a very small thing there. And then there's this interview findings section with two main findings. One is about how rote memorization's not working, and then one about how there's some evidence that gamifying an experience could be beneficial. So my recommendations here would be to clearly put the finding that you discovered in the heading above each of these sections. So for this first one, instead of saying contextual emphasis, it could say something like rote learning is not working. And then for the second one, you could say something like students like engaging with games. I think that would make this much easier to scan. And then over here, there's this other interview findings, which I think is fine to include. I would recommend moving this down below interview findings because it's kind of out of order when you read it. So that would help this flow a little bit better. And then next, there's a section called literature study, where she talks about how she looked into other research that's been done about gamification and talks about this framework that was discovered. I think doing something like this is a great idea, and it kind of supports some of those research findings that she was talking about earlier. And then it talks about some examples of how this has worked in other apps, which I think is all a great idea. And anybody watching can also use that idea in your own case studies, where you look into academic research that supports some of your findings. And next, there is the section about user personas and empathy maps, which I think is fine to include. But what I'm seeing consistently through this case study is that many of these images are very small and the text is hard to read. So my recommendation would be to stack these on top of each other to double the size of each one and make that text easier to read. Now, the next section is about how she did comparison between other apps or other language learning apps and concluded that one of the missing aspects was that they don't include storytelling through video in their experiences. And then below here, she conducts some interviews with students where she tries to learn what the optimal length of a video is, which is all good. But I read through this whole case study, and it looks like this whole point about video is just dropped later on. There's no further mention of videos being incorporated into the app. So my recommendation here would be to either talk more about the incorporating videos later on, about why you did or didn't do that, or just take this section out completely. But generally speaking, with case studies, I would say to make sure that if a big point like this is introduced, it's brought up later on so that people aren't left wondering like what happened with this whole aspect of the case study. And now moving on, there is this section about ideation where she's asking these how can you questions, like how can you motivate teenagers to open an app? How can you show learning material in context? How can you make irregular verbs fun? So I think all of these are good things to be including. These are all related to the problem and related to what was brought up in the research. So no problem with that. And then there is this brainstorming session where there's these diagrams about like different potential flows, it looks like. But my biggest problem with this is that you can't really read any of these diagrams. They're all too small. And having 5 different diagrams is pretty difficult to interpret if you're a reader looking at this case study. So my recommendation would be to maybe just include 3 diagrams, maybe even 2, and make them much larger so that the readers can actually see the text on there. And then we move on to this concepting section. And in here, there's this diagram about conditions, functional wishes, user wishes, and design limitations. But it looks like all of these, like, being child friendly, don't be a burden in lessons, be accessible for Apple and Android, must motivate them. It seems like these are all obvious things to include in an app. So I don't think this is really further telling the whole story of the design decision making that was made. So I would say it could be a good idea just to take the section out completely. Then it would help to shorten that case study a little bit as well. And then moving on, there is this mood board section where she's looking at other apps as for inspiration, some colors that are being used. So I think that's all good there. And then we get to this wireframing section. So in this section, it's basically just saying, so I started sketching screens, and I have sketched different types of screens and ideas, and then showing just some of these wireframes here. I would actually recommend taking this section out. The reason is that it's not really adding to the whole story of the design. It's kind of just working as like a checklist item, just saying like, I did wireframing. So I don't think you really need that. I don't have any low fidelity wireframes in my portfolio. Taking this out would also help to shorten the case study. Now moving on to this next section. This is all about the high fidelity designs that were made, and there's this paragraph discussing the app at high level here. She talks about the naming of the app, how students can engage in games, how they can use these free out of jail cards in the experience, and also the decision to make the app in English. So all of those things are fine to talk about, but I think we need to rewind and think about the main purpose of this app. So the main thing this app is doing is teaching irregular verbs to students through mini games or quizzes within this whole experience. But that aspect of the app is barely touched on in this section here. I think the most important thing to talk about here is the rationale behind these games and the whole experience of learning through them. And also talking about why you believe this whole solution could be better than the traditional learning environment that they've had in a classroom. And then another thing is that the screens that are shown here are the home screen, the profile screen, and the empty states here. So I think when you're showing screens in a high fidelity prototype section like this, it needs to be covering the whole main experience, which is those games. So I would say the main focus needs to be on that whole experience in both what you're talking about in that text and the screenshots there. Now, the next section here is on testing, how she came up with this plan to test the whole prototype. And there's this pretty in-depth test plan here that's written in this document. But I would say this whole document is very small, hard to read, kind of like some of the other images throughout this case study. So I don't think anyone's really going to take the time to look through this. So my recommendation would be to talk about some of the main steps in that test plan in some bullet points. So that's easy to scan and easy to follow along with what you're doing here. And then there is this other section about how the test was conducted, and then the results, which is all great. But I would also recommend putting the results in bullet points here. Again, making this a little bit easier to follow along with. And now we'll move on to the next section, which is on iterations that were done based on some of that research. So there's one iteration where they updated one of the games to include a fill-in-the-blank sentence that more closely aligns with how students take tests. There is another one where they're prompting students to update their weekly goals. Another one where they updated the Joker system. And this one where they're prompting students to complete one of the mini games in the onboarding experience to get them more familiar with the app. Another one with this pop-up to make sure they want to leave one of the pages. And then there's this one where they added a notification system to encourage students to keep coming back to the app. So I think this section is great. All of them except for the pop-up have to do with the core experience of learning in this app. And I think all of these are doing a good job at helping to solve that problem. So fantastic job on this section. I would just say this fifth iteration about adding the pop-up can be taken out here since it doesn't really have to do with the core experience. But overall, this is exactly what should be in a UX case study. Now we'll move on to the final section, which is results and lessons learned and future steps. So in the results section, she's talking about some of the results of usability testing and a recap of some of those iterations, which is a great thing to talk about. But I think in a results section for a case study like this, it really needs to cover more about the rationale for believing whether or not the original problem was going to be solved with this app. And then in the future steps section, a good thing to cover would be talking about what you'd be looking for if this app were to go into development and were to really be used by students in a real world scenario. Like what kind of data that you would need to know whether or not that problem was solved, and if students are learning irregular verbs at a higher level compared to their previous learning methods. So I think that would really help to round out this whole case study. And now, the last thing I wanted to mention here is that there's this link to prototype button here at the bottom. Also a great thing to include, but it kind of looks like these are two buttons right next to each other. So this link to prototype text looks like a text link, and then button, which is the button, which is clearly a button. So I think that the button can be taken out here and it can just be a text link saying link to prototype. That's just a small detail that I think can be improved. So those are the main things that I had to say for this portfolio review. Faith, thank you so much for sending in your portfolio. I really appreciate that, and I hope this was helpful. And I hope this was helpful to anybody else watching looking to improve their portfolio. I'll see you guys in the next one.